This is a video tutorial for Phil 123, Module 8 on Frankfurt type scenarios. I want to spend some time talking about the philosopher Harry Frankfurt and his contributions to the literature on free will and compatibilism in particular. Now, just to be clear, like people like Hume, like people like Ayer, Frankfurt is an example of a compatibilist philosopher. He's not a hard compatibilist, he's what we call a soft compatibilist. Frankfurt probably doesn't think that just any kind of determination is compatible with freedom, but he does think that some kinds of determination are. Now, it's kind of hard to understate just how important Frankfurt's contributions to the free will literature are. In a series of papers, really during the 1970s, Frankfurt significantly contributed to the conversation about free will. It's sometimes said that philosophy is all a 2,400-year-old footnote to Plato, that we haven't advanced at all since Plato. I actually think the free will literature is a pretty good example of a place where we have made some advancements. That's not to say there's nothing about free will that's confusing. That's not to say our forefathers, our philosophical ancestors were confused and that we, their progeny, are not. But it is probably the case that we're confused in more complicated and more interesting ways than our philosophical forefathers were. And Frankfurt's a really good example of someone who a lot of people think has really nailed what one of the problems in the free will debate is. One of the things that compatibilists and incompatibilists disagree about, and has made a very compelling case for compatibilism. There's a couple things going on in the Frankfurt piece. One is an attack on incompatibilism, and the other is sort of an implicit argument for compatibilism. And I want to talk about both of those things in Frankfurt's paper. What is the attack on incompatibilism? Well, if you remember, one of the things that incompatibilists think is that the truth of determinism is incompatible with free will, that it can't both be true, that the thesis of determinism is true, that is, that all of our actions are determined by the laws of nature and previous states of events, and that anybody has free will. And one of the things Frankfurt thinks that all incompatibilists are going to believe is that someone could have free will only if it's true that they could have done otherwise. Now, in a very simple reading of what that means, think about the implications there. If determinism is true, then nobody right now can do otherwise than know exactly what they're doing. Why? Because all of our actions are determined by the laws of nature and what happened earlier. Given those laws and given what happened earlier, if determinism is true, then no one could do otherwise than exactly what they're doing right now. So any incompatibilist, says Frankfurt, by definition, is going to have to endorse what Frankfurt calls the principle of alternative possibilities. A person is morally responsible for what she does only if she could have done otherwise. For the sake of convenience, Frankfurt calls the principle of alternative possibilities PAP. Okay. Now, what Frankfurt is going to argue is that PAP is simply false. And along the way, he's going to not only give us his reasons for thinking that PAP is false, and thereby thinking that something's wrong with incompatibilism, but to give us an argument for compatibilism as well. Now again, it's crucial for Frankfurt's argument to work that you really do think that PAP is something that any incompatibilist is going to have to endorse. If so, and Frankfurt can show there's something wrong with PAP, then he can show there's something wrong with incompatibilism. It might be worth wondering whether or not you think incompatibilists really do accept PAP, whether there's some other principle that they could be or should be endorsing instead. But I'm going to let that slide for a moment. So again, that's Frankfurt's target. He's targeting incompatibilism, and he's going to do that by attacking what he calls the principle of alternative possibilities. Now, Frankfurt's argument consists in some ways of a counterexample, or a series of clever counterexamples that are supposed to illustrate that PAP is false. The most interesting counterexample involves two fellows, Black and Jones. Black is a kind of neuroscientist, and he wants to get this guy Jones under control. There's something that Jones is going to do, or not, and Black wants him to act in a certain way. So let me just give an example here, skipping over some of the details. Imagine that Black is a fiercely democratic neurosurgeon, and he wants to make sure that Jones votes for Obama. So what Black has done is installed a chip in Jones's head. Again, remember, he's a neuroscientist. This chip allows Dr. Black to do two things. First of all, it allows him to monitor Jones's thoughts. If Black gets any indication that Jones is going to do something that he doesn't want him to do, for example, vote for Romney or something like that, then Black is going to enable the switch, which allows him to do the second thing, and that is take over Jones. Okay, it allows him to take control of Jones's mind and his body. So here's the idea. If if Dr. Black gets any indication that Jones is going to do something besides vote for Obama, he's going to intervene. He's going to put the whammy on Jones, he's going to take over, and he's going to make Jones vote for Obama in those cases. Now remember what I said. Frankfurt is an example of a soft compatibilist. He doesn't think that freedom is compatible with any kind of determination. This would be a pretty obvious case where Black puts the whammy on Jones, takes him over, and forces him to do something he doesn't want to do. This would be a pretty clear case where the soft compatibilist would say, absolutely, that's a case of unfriendly determination. In that case, Jones would not be free. But what Frankfurt wants us to imagine is that something different happens. Jones still has the chip in his head, and Black stands at the ready, prepared to intervene if Jones gives any indication that he's not going to do what Black wants him to do. But imagine instead that Jones thinks about it for himself, decides for his own reasons, makes up his own mind that yes, he will vote for Obama, goes into that voting booth, pulls the lever or marks the thing, whatever voting mechanism it is, and he does exactly what Black wants him to do. What we're supposed to imagine in that scenario is that even though Black has been waiting, he never has to show his hand, to use Frankfurt's way of saying it. He never has to do anything. Why? Because Jones decided, all on his own, independent of Black, to do exactly what Black wanted him to do. Okay, the question is, do you think that Jones was free? Do you think he acted freely when he voted for Obama? It's hard to see what the problem could be. Admittedly, if Black had intervened, Jones would not have been free. That kind of determination would have been incompatible with freedom. But remember, Black didn't intervene in this scenario. What happened is that Jones made up his own mind for his own reasons. He was not compelled. He was not coerced. He seems to be as free as anybody could be. He acts for his own reasons. He does what he wants, and he gets exactly what he wants. And most importantly, he does what he wants because he wants to do it. There's simply no problematic kinds of determination that we can see. Here's the kicker then. Frankfurt insists that in this particular scenario, a kind of scenario that has come to be called a Frankfurt-type scenario, it's still true of Jones that he could not have done otherwise. He couldn't have done otherwise. Well, if he tried to vote for Romney or a third-party candidate or something like that, Dr. Black would have put the whammy on him and made him vote for Obama. So no matter what Jones is doing, he's voting for Obama. It's just a question of why. So Frankfurt thinks it's false that Jones could have done otherwise, but nonetheless it's true that he acted freely. Okay. Now, whether you think this particular thought experiment works is really, really, really important. If you think that Frankfurt's right, that Jones acted perfectly freely, then it looks like PAP is false. If that's right, then there's something wrong with incompatibilism, in which case you should probably be a compatibilist. By contrast, if you're an incompatibilist, you really need to figure out what's missing in this scenario, what the problem is. Now, there's a huge literature on these Frankfurt-type scenarios. There's some people that have spent their whole professional career talking about thought experiments like this. There's plenty of literature there if you want to see it. What Frankfurt recommends is that we replace the principle of alternative possibilities, PAP, with something else, what he calls PAP star. According to PAP star, okay, the problem is not, or excuse me, the thesis is not that someone is morally responsible for what they do only if they could have done otherwise. What we should be saying is that a person's morally responsible for what she does only if it's not the case that she does what she does because she could not have done otherwise. Importantly, in the Frankfurt scenario, the reason that Jones does what he does is not because he couldn't have done otherwise. He does what he does because of his own desires, his own decisions, and own intentions. So Frankfurt thinks PAP star is a perfectly reasonable proposition. It's a perfectly reasonable thesis, but it's one that's completely compatible with determinism. And that's why Frankfurt is a compatibilist.